Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti a questa le ultime conferenze del festival. Vi ringrazio per essere qui così numerosi e a nome del festival vi ringrazio per aver partecipato e per aver reso questi giorni così ricchi e importanti. Siamo qui per una conferenza tra le quali personalmente, a cui probabilmente tengo di più, perché è un tema che interessa tutti noi. Si parla di sicurezza alimentare. Non so se sapete che prima della nascita della FDA in America, la Food and Drug Administration, e dell'EFSA qui in Europa, non c'era un regolamento sull'uso di additivi e di conservanti, quindi si potevano trovare negli alimenti la formaldeide, il borace, insomma sostanze tossiche e velenose, e non essendoci regole venivano utilizzate perché evidentemente avevano una qualche funzione. Poi un giorno, grazie a un gruppo di valorosi pionieri chiamati la Poison Squad, la squadra dei veleni, le regole sono state scritte, sono state per la prima volta impostate, e quindi da allora abbiamo la sicurezza alimentare. Questa storia, che è una storia affascinante, meravigliosa, ci verrà raccontata oggi da un personaggio mitico. Lei è una giornalista scientifica, una delle più importanti giornaliste scientifiche del mondo, scrive per giornali di altissimo livello, dal New York Times in giù, dirige il centro per il giornalismo scientifico dell'MIT di Boston, un centro molto importante per chi fa il mio mestiere, e nel 1992 ha vinto il Premio Pulitzer per un'inchiesta sulla ricerca sui primati, da cui poi è nato un libro che è diventato un bestseller, che si chiama The Monkey Wars. Di libri e di bestseller ne ha scritti tanti, l'ultimo dei quali si chiama proprio The Poison Squad, che dà il titolo alla conferenza che andremo ad ascoltare, e vi chiedo un grande applauso per Deborah Blum. Grazie.
Oops. Back. Go back. Buongiorno. It is such an honor for me to be here at this amazing festival in this beautiful part of Italy and in this amazing theater, so thank you so much for inviting me here. I guess I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself, which will make me sound a little creepy, which is that I am a writer who is really fascinated by poisonous things. I'm only interested in things that kill you. I've been writing about poisons now for a decade, and my previous book, The Poisoner's Handbook, was really focused on both how you kill someone and how you catch a killer. And people have asked me how I ended up writing this book, which is very focused on food. So it starts really with the title of this book, The Poison Squad. And the Poison Squad was an American newspaper nickname for one of the most unusual experiments in public health anywhere in the world. It was run in Washington, D.C. by a U.S. government chemist who came up with an experiment in which he got his colleagues at the U.S. Department of Agriculture to agree to let him deliberately poison every meal they ate for months. And that was the first test of additives in food in the United States in the early 20th century. So I started thinking to myself, why would you do an experiment like that? Why would you feel that the situation was so desperate that you had no other choice but to poison your colleagues in an ongoing experiment of what was in food? And to understand that, I want to go back briefly to the 19th century in particular. One of the things, as I started researching this book, which was a huge surprise to me, is that I realized I had a kind of romantic mythology about the 19th century, and I had imagined my ancestors eating nothing but wonderfully healthy food. Apples, untainted by pesticides picked from trees, and farm fresh milk, and wonderful cheeses and breads, and only the best of coffees and meats. And it became very clear to me as I started looking at the food of the 19th century, which is the food before government regulation, in a period that there are no laws about what makes food safe or not, in the United States in particular, but for about a half of the 19th century in Europe, that food was not, in fact, nearly as romantic and wonderful as I had first thought. So to give you a quick example of that, this is a food factory, actually, from the 19th century, pre-safety regulation, pre-hygiene regulation. This particular factory is an American candy factory. And so this was pretty much the way they slopped candy together in the 19th century, and there were no inspections to see if any of this was clean or if good ingredients were used. And unless you read English and sort of this sort of Baroque way of writing in the 19th century, you won't be able to read this page from an investigator's journal. But this, in fact, was when my scientist, Harvey Washington Wiley, who's started stepping up on the American food supply, started sending out inspectors to factories like this. And what you will see in this main line is it references the deaths of children in related to eating the candy. Now, why was that? Because in the 19th century, among the things that were not regulated were the use of heavy metal dyes and metallic dyes in candy. And as most of you probably know, the most popular dye to create the color green in the 19th century was arsenic trioxide. And the most popular dye to create red and yellow was lead, yellow chromate, red lead. So that most of the candies that were given to children, if they were colored by either arsenic or lead. And the first food safety law in Britain, or the UK, came about in the 1860s after 24 children died from candy that had been over-colored by arsenic, right? And you'll see this in the history of regulation, the scandal that leads to the regulation, and I'm going to talk about that some. But even after Britain sets up its first food regulations in the 1860s, and around then you see some other countries clustered in Europe doing the same thing. The United States is very resistant to this. This is actually from a very famous book early in the history of food safety that was published in London by a German chemist, Friedrich Ackham, and he used this grisly cover, Death in the Pot, and he actually wrote about some of these issues, some of the use of heavy metals in food, but he changed nothing. It was just a matter that people were gradually starting to be aware. So what I want to talk about before I get into some of the toxicity issues again is some of the fakery that is permitted in the 19th century under this non-regulation. If you can imagine a paradise for food manufacturers in which there are no rules. You can put anything you want into a product, anything. You don't have to label it. You don't have to use what you say it is on the front of the jar, and there is no law or regulation that can call you at fault if in fact you don't. And so I start with coffee because it's like an essential of life. There is no day that starts without coffee for me. And so I was very obsessed with 19th century coffee. If you look over, man, it's going to be this German one here at Cafe Essence. The rule there was it didn't have to have any coffee in it at all. It was just essence of coffee. And so you, the consumer, might go to the store and pick up a can labeled coffee essence, but there would be no coffee at all. And so what did they use? Well, when my scientist, Harvey Wiley, and when his comparable food safety scientists in Europe and in Canada and other places started looking in cans of ground coffee, they found that it was often just various ground seeds. Chicory was popular in the United States. Sawdust was a common ingredient in coffee. Burnt rope was handy, right? You could burn a rope and crumble it up. It would look like ground coffee. And ground bone, charred and ground bone was often found in coffee. And some of these cans of coffee, if it said coffee like this, it had to have, in general, it have about 10% real coffee, but no more than that. And so one of the things that happens as consumers start realizing that when they're buying ground 19th century coffee, they are only getting an assortment of plants and dirt and other objects, is people start buying coffee beans. And then you can actually find an industry in fake coffee beans. It's just really creative. They create these molds in which you can press something that's going to look like a coffee bean into the mold. And the primary constituents of that are wax and dirt, clay, wax, dirt, and you make these fake-looking beans. And in this time period, of course, people would go to the grocery store. The grocer would scoop out a scoop of coffee beans for you. And the grocers were secretly getting advertisement from the fake bean companies saying, "Dear grocer, we can triple your profits. Coffee beans are expensive. Just mix in our sort of beans and you will have this much more profitable industry." And so they did. And in fact, there was one interview I read with a doctor in the United States. I don't know if you all have ever heard the term a muddy cup of coffee. It may be more of an American term, but it's like a very thick, dark cup of coffee is sometimes called a muddy cup of coffee. In this case, he thought it was just because there was so much mud in the coffee. And so I found myself thinking, what did things taste like in the 19th century? I'm going to mention a couple of other things. Spices, once people started looking at spices, these tended to be about 90 to 100% fake. So the most common thing you would find in cloves or paprika or cinnamon or any of the red spices was brick dust. Brick dust, they would take the original and they would mix it with brick dust. Black pepper was a lot like coffee. In fact, the scientists didn't even call it coffee. If you were in a lab, you called it pepperette because it was some kind of fake coffee that had some kind of ground up dark something in it. And the American spice producers liked coconut shells and seashells, and they would import them by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tons, grind them up and color them and use them in these different spices. So again, when you go back and you wonder what did things taste like, I think we have no idea what foods tasted like in this period of time because what we think went into it never went into it. Oops, got a little carried away there. So eventually, just to overcome mistrust, you would see something, this is just labeled pure spices, in an effort to persuade people there were actually spices in the jar, people would start using the word pure. Pure spices, or in this ad for whiskey, you'll see it says straight pure rye, if you can, in that line that describes the rye. Not blended, not adulterated, not faked. There was so much mistrust in the food supply in the 19th century that pretty soon you see manufacturers having to say, this is not a fake, this is pure, this is real, trust me, which nobody did, right? And I wanted to mention this in the honor of being in Italy. Most of you probably know this. Vin Mariani was developed by a scientist in Sicily, actually. And you'll notice in this small ad, the black and white ad, that this particular one is praised by the Pope. It was a real pick-me-up. It was heavily laced with cocaine. And so, if you were a little tired and you wanted to get a real buzz, but also be really pepped up, you would get Vin Mariani. It was a huge international bestseller. It was copied in the United States by soft drink makers So that if you look at the early ads for Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola doesn't even mess around, right? It's cocaine. And so when you were drinking Coca-Cola in the 19th century, you were drinking quite a lot of cocaine. And in the advertisements, it says something like this: "You tired?" Right? Drink a glass of Mariani, drink a glass of Coca-Cola, and you are really going to be awake because of the cocaine. And in the US, Coke did not start taking the cocaine out until about 1902, when they were forced to do it by state, not by federal legislation, but by state legislation. So I want to now drop back and talk about toxicity, and not just the weirdness of the fraud, but again in this era where we have no regulation, we have no government standing for what I'm going to call consumer protection. That's not the job of the government. We have to have governments agree that part of their job is to protect the general public, right? And to protect the public in their everyday life. And I'm going to put my bias up front and say, yeah, absolutely, the job of the government is to protect us in our everyday life. So in this case, I want to use milk as an example of the complete failure of government protections. This particular slide is by a famous American cartoonist, Thomas Nash. He was most famous for skewering corruption in government, but in this case he took on corruption in milk. And so in this slide, what you see is the skeleton serving the milk to the mother and her children. And this was very traditional at this time in the way people lived. They would go to the market and the milk would be dipped out for them, and they would carry their cans or their bottles of milk home after it was served to them by a skeleton. Not really by a skeleton, but why would he do this? So I'm going to use the American market as a case study in really bad actions. So what you have in the 19th century, which is the period of the Industrial Revolution, is people are moving away from their farms where they have their own cow and they're right next to farm fresh milk, and they're moving into the cities and they're taking factory jobs and they're cramming in, and these jobs don't pay incredibly well, so they have to stretch every penny or lira depending on where they're working and what they're doing. And so the dairymen in America realized that these guys are not going to be able to buy a lot of farm fresh milk, but also they can cheat them into thinking it is. And so what happens is there becomes the practice of just watering the milk. That was one of the practices. Just water the milk down. And you can find these 19th century recipes that will calculate how much water you can put in the milk before it turns too blue, because you've taken all the protein out of it. And then they would come back and they would recolor the milk. And the two most popular things for that were chalk, white chalk, and plaster of Paris. So they recolor the milk. They've removed most of the protein from it, however, but they want to give it an illusion of being farm fresh milk. So they re-whiten it, and then to recreate all the cream that they've skimmed off for the rich people. And a lot of this food fraud was targeted at people who were working class, people who didn't have, enough money to own a farm or whatever. But in the Midwest, in the American Midwest, which would be in the area of Chicago, if you know American geography, the most popular way to replace the cream was that when calves died, they would puree their brains, and then they would make that and that would create a kind of creamy, scummy layer that they could float on top of the coffee and the milk bottles. And so people would get this milk. It was half water. It was colored with chalk. It had raw calf brains floating on top of it, which they would pretty much discover when they poured the cream into the coffee, and the brains would cook in the coffee, right? But other than that, if they didn't do that, they didn't know. So there's two other things now that are going on with milk. Oh, I forgot. I also have a Thomas Nash slide of watering milk. And so in this, on the milk cart, it says pure country milk. And behind it, you see the dairyman pouring water into the can of milk so that their customers get this watered down milk. He wouldn't have done this if this wasn't an everyday practice. This is everyday practice, right? And so what happens, however, is there are two things going on in the 19th century. One is there's really not very good refrigeration. In fact, none. People use ice, right? There will be ice boxes. If you have enough money, you have ice. If you don't, sometimes people would have like a cold house, a cold corner of their house or a part in their basement that was extra cool, and they'd put their perishable stuff there. And there's not really pasteurization. Louis Pasteur and the rise of pasteurization comes in later in the 19th, and it's very resisted. It actually was adopted much more quickly and effectively in Europe and the US. So the milk rots, right? So you've got this really bad milk. The introduction of the water tended often to introduce bacteria, and there was quite a lovely case I looked at in Indiana in which a family had brought their bottle of milk to the public health department because it was wiggling in the bottom. And when the public health department ran an analysis of the milk, they discovered that that dairy farmer had mixed his milk with water from a local pond, and that what they were seeing wiggling in the bottom of their milk was horsehair worms. So they fortunately didn't drink those, but this kind of practice led to an awful lot of really bad bacteria growing in milk. And milk's a great substrate for pathogenic bacteria. Anyway, it has proteins, it has sugars, there's all kinds of different pathogenic bacteria that love raw milk. There's no pasteurization, there's no refrigeration, but as it turns out, in the American Civil War, a particular embalming agent that had just been effectively ginned up and created and synthesized in laboratories in Europe becomes widely available, and that's formaldehyde. And formaldehyde is a wonderful preservative when you're trying to, embalm a dead body. And in the American Civil War, formaldehyde washes across the land. Tens and tens of thousands of people are dead and have to be preserved. And literally the dairy men say, hey, look at that preservative. It keeps these bodies in really great shape. I bet that it might do something like that with milk. So I actually have never tasted formaldehyde. And I advise against it. Don't go out based after this talk and, swig a little formaldehyde. It would really be a bad health move. But formaldehyde, from what I hear from my chemist friends, is kind of sweet. And so if you pour formaldehyde into rotting milk, it will cover up some of the taste of the sourness in the rot because of the sweetness of the formaldehyde. And it will restore some of the protein so the milk looks less clotty and horrible even as it rots. And so you start in the late 19th century seeing ads, and they don't call this formaldehyde, they call it preservaline or rosaline, but these are preservatives that they put into milk. There are advertisements that says, hey, American consumers, just buy a bottle of milk and leave it on the counter for 2 weeks. It's great. The miracle of science is going to give you this milk that will never rot. And so anytime that you want during the next 2 weeks, you can just pour yourself a glass of this delicious, healthy liquid, which leads us to, I recognize this is in English, so I'm going to translate it. It's short. The headline of this newspaper story from the New York Times is "Embalmed Milk in Oklahoma." It's in Omaha. And so what you start seeing, if you actually start looking at newspapers in the United States at this time, is embalmed milk scandals. And what that means is that this formaldehyde-laced milk is killing people. And it's usually killing children. So in this case, if you drill down in this very short piece that was in the New York Times, this is in the 1890s, the public health officials are now saying to the people who live in Omaha, Nebraska, don't buy any milk. Please don't buy any milk. Don't buy any butter. Don't buy any cheese. Don't buy anything. There's too much formaldehyde in the milk supply, and we are starting to see some very sick children. And this starts playing out all over the country. There was a case in Indianapolis in which 400 children died in one summer from drinking embalmed milk. And guess what happens to the dairymen? Absolutely nothing. It's not against the law to put formaldehyde in milk. There are no laws about safety standards in food, and there are no laws about labeling. There is nothing that requires them even to put this on the label. And you also have, I'm going to mention this briefly because they come back into my story. This is one of the American meat packers, Swift and Company, in a very romantic look at one of their railroad cars that carried meat across the country. But you also have embalmed meat scandals in the United States in particular. This one preceded, this is a sort of satire on the situation from Puck, the British magazine. Shortly after the Spanish-American War, there was a huge scandal. It turned out that the meat that was being sent to soldiers in the U.S. war with Cuba was killing more soldiers than the Spanish were. And if you don't know the Spanish-American War, this was a war between the U.S. and Spain over theoretically over Cuban independence. The Cubans wanted to be free of Spain. They were fighting the Spanish occupation. The Spanish had decided the answer to that was concentration camps, and his name was Whaler. They called him Butcher Whaler. Set up concentration camps across Cuba, and somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, mostly women and children, starved to death in those camps. So there was a patriotic upswelling of people who really liked to go to war, frankly, in the United States, who said, well, how can we tolerate this? We're a new democracy. Here we see this colonial butchery, a couple hundred miles from our coast. We have to do something, and the U.S. goes to war in Cuba, and the soldiers and wins, leading to all kinds of other problems and complications. But in the course of that war, the soldiers are poisoned by this horrible meat that has formaldehyde in it. Teddy Roosevelt, who later became President Theodore, Teddy Roosevelt testifies that when he tries to make the soldiers eat the meat, he just makes them throw up. It's a huge scandal, and nothing continues to happen. So the government nods, holds hearings, tut-tut, this is really too bad. The embalmed meat hearings just proved that the meat in the American grocery store was as bad as the meat that they ate in the Army. Therefore, the Army was not responsible. And so you see this kind of gamesmanship, and nothing happened until let me see if I can just stand right under this guy. This guy, the tallest guy, this bunch of cowboys-looking guys that you see here are the chemists in the Bureau of Chemistry at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1893. Actually, I think this is 1883. And they were, these 10 guys were responsible, and they were the only ones for the health and safety of food in the entire United States. This is the only department. There is no FDA, there is no EPA, there are no other agencies that are interested in food. And until Wiley, the tall guy I was standing up to, comes and he is the head chemist, they don't care about food safety anyway. But he does. He is a man on his mission about food safety. He's the father of a preacher who raised him to do nothing but good. He fought for the North in the Civil War. He has exposed bad food in the Midwest before he came, and he launches them on this crusade to just find out what food is like. And that's why you hear me talking, everything I'm telling you about coffee and other bad products are really from the series of investigations that he starts in the 1880s and 1890s, and they look at dairy, and they look at meat, and they look at coffee, fake. They look at spices, fake. They look at canned vegetables poisoned by lead. They go through all of these horrors, right? And they start then saying to Congress, can we get legislation? And Congress says no. No. Sorry, that would inconvenience business. And so throughout the 1990s, you see this sort of back and forth of legislation and frustration until there are a couple of allies. This looks a little weird with all my old images here. This is a piece I wrote for National Geographic that was just out in February about some of the unlikely allies in the fight to make food safe. And this is Henry J. Heinz, who launched the Heinz Company. And he was a very strange industrialist in the sense that he actually took a lead in trying to make food safe. He had to reinvent ketchup to get preservatives out of it, so he did. The 19th century ketchup was a thin, runny kind of liquid that was often stewed pumpkin rinds dyed red with an Allen coal-tar dye and preserved by sodium benzoate. And so he actually set his laboratories to work trying to figure out a ketchup that would be preservative-free. It turned out it had to be thick. It had to have a lot of tomato acid in it. It had to have a lot of pulp. It had to have a lot of vinegar. So he reinvented ketchup. And he also campaigned for food safety laws in the United States. And he sent his people to meet with Roosevelt and to really push for this. Not to great effect until a certain point, but he was definitely an ally. And so were women. And this is one of the really interesting secrets of the American push for food safety, which is, here we are, it's right about the turn of the 20th century. Women can't vote, right? The American women don't get the right to vote until the 1920s. And yet they have organized, this is them protesting for the vote, but they're organizing as a really powerful force. They create clubs and organizations all over the country, and they push. And they organize, and they march, and they pressure politicians, and they actually make a difference. And Harvey Wiley would later say that they would never have gotten a food law in the United States if they hadn't gone to all these incredibly organized women who, without the ability to vote, still wanted to change the country for the better and figured out other ways to do it. So these were his main allies. This food law keeps going into Congress, keeps getting kicked back, and finally, in 1902, he says, okay, we know there's this landscape of awful stuff. We know the government won't do anything. Every time I bring it forward, then the answer is, well, we don't really know if this is safe or not. There's no tests done, and so I guess I'm just going to test it, and I'm going to test it on people. I'm going to skip any possible animal model. I'm going to set up a series of experiments where we just feed the most best known and most commonly used additives in the American food supply to young government workers. And he actually set up something that he called the hygienic table trials, which the Washington Post thought was a really boring name and renamed the Poison Squad. And then they recruited people. Here was the deal. You're going to get 3 free meals a day, 7 days a week. We're going to hire a professional chef. The food's going to be that wonderful 19th century food we all dream about. Farm fresh, no preservatives, right? Absolutely beautifully cooked. And the only catch is you have to agree to be blood tested and urine tested and weighed and measured and checked by doctors, and you can only eat what we give you. And half of you at any given time are going to be adding capsules of some kind of food additive to your food, and we're going to compare the two groups. And then that was the premise. And people signed up from all over the country. They literally were beating away the volunteers. You know, and people said, well, why? Why would you sign up for that? And part of it was, there's no labels. There's very little public information about this. This is a dogfight between people who are food crusaders or pure food advocates, and industry and government officials, but the general public does not have that much information about what's going on. So a lot of people were like, hey, test me. They ended up only using young men in their 20s. Oh, I have a picture of them dining in the USDA dining room here. And they just thought they were, in their kind of Edwardian Victorian way, they said these would be the strongest and sturdiest specimens, and we're not actually trying to kill anyone, so let's try to get really healthy people into our experiment. Actually, you know, scientifically, you have a uniform group. That's not all a bad thing sometimes. But they got these guys to sign up, and they started out giving them capsules of borax. I don't know if you guys get borax here much, but it's a cleaning supply. You can find it in the Clean Your Kitchen section. In the US, it's called 20 Mule Team Borax. And it's poisonous, right? And it was a hugely popular food preservative. It was in a lot of milk and cheese and meat. And you could get an unlimited number of doses depending on how many of those kind of products you ate. Harvey Wiley, the chemist, said he picked it because he thought it was the safest of the group he wanted to look at, and he wanted to ease into this experiment. And so he was completely shocked. Every week they would just ratchet the dose up a little in those capsules. He was completely shocked when people got sick. They got really sick in the end. They were, you know, nauseated. Some of them couldn't stand up. They had terrible headaches. They had gastroenteritis. They had tremors. They finally just said, we're stopping this experiment now, and we're getting everyone off this. And they published this, and it just was nationwide front page news, right? And in fact, I have one short take from the New York Times. Poison squad escapes federal food experts. This is the end of the experiment. They're escaping. And there's this many, sublines as there used to be. Professor Wiley held the microscope while his voluntary victims wriggled. So the real image of this is these scientists, holding these guys captive and poisoning them, and they're getting really sick. And if you read this story, it will say, this is the lead, the young men who have been eating poisons under the direction of the Agriculture Department. And the most important thing in that sentence is they're saying eating poisons, and what they're saying is eating poisons that are in your food. This is in your food every day. This is what you get at the grocery store. So you're eating those poisons too, American consumers. And this goes nationwide. They move on to the next one. It looks worse. They move on to formaldehyde. They had to call the formaldehyde experiment in about a week, right? Because they really did think they were going to kill people. They looked at salicylic acid. They looked at copper sulfate, which I'm going to show you a slide related to that later. They start working their way through these. There's this enormous rising fury in the United States of people realizing that the food supply is poisoning them, and the government not doing anything, and yet nothing is still happening. Roosevelt has finally said, I know we're going to lose, but I'm in support of this law. Congress tanks it. There's all this popular, our dark, Wiley cure for adulterations and fake food. Everyone loves Wiley. But nothing happens until this book, The Jungle, is published by Upton Sinclair. Does everyone here know the book? It's a famous book in the United States. So this is a great story that I think I have a little time to tell you. And then I'm almost done. So Upton Sinclair was a socialist writer. He was a freelance writer. He didn't have any money, so he joined the Socialist Party and was for the rights of the workers. And he got very interested in a butcher strike in Chicago with the Chicago meat packers that I was showing you. And he went out to Chicago. He had a journalistic background, and he lived in the packing yards. And he took voluminous notes. He was so poor, he blended right in with the poor workers, brought back this book, and he wrote it for a socialist newspaper in the United States called Appeal to Reason, and then he took it to New York, and the first publisher said to him, I'm never publishing this horrible story, and he took it to another publisher called Doubleday Page, and they agreed to publish the book, and the book is both a cry for the plight of the worker, and it is a detailed picture of what it is like in the meat processing industry in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, which is grisly, right? And it has, blood-caked walls, and it has, they have poisoned bread out for the rats in the factories, and the rats and the poisoned bread all go into the sausage, and sometimes the workers fall into the lye pits, and the workers go into the sausage, and there's tuberculosis and all. I mean, it's really gruesome. And so his publisher said, this just can't possibly be real, and we're not going to publish it. And so they sent an investigative team to Chicago, and their team came back and said, oh my God, it's worse. It's worse than in the book. And so they decided to publish the book. They published the book. Immediately, the Packers deny everything. Roosevelt says, okay, I'm going to send out my own investigative team. Surely this can't be true. No one could believe how bad it was. Roosevelt sends his own team to Chicago. They come back, they say, oh my God, it's worse. It's worse than in the book, right? And they had seen like dead animals that had been sloughed off into latrines and thrown into, it was really bad. And so Roosevelt is stuck with this is meat scandal is the fire, right? Roosevelt is stuck with this horrible mess. The U.S. meat supply is a complete travesty. He cannot get Congress to do anything to even do meat inspections. He's desperate. And so he blackmails Congress. He calls in the leading members of Congress and he shows them the report of his investigators. And he says, if you don't pass a bill, I'm going to publish this. And they go, too bad, right? And so he does publish about 8 pages of that report. An enormous scandal. Everyone in Europe cancels their contracts with the United States. The meat industry is going down in flame. In a few months, in June 1906, we passed the first Meat Inspection Act in the United States. It's the act we still have today. And 2 months later, in this groundswell of fury in the United States, you've been giving us this horrible food and charging us all this money, and nobody told us, and government has been way too on the side of industry. We get the first Food and Drug Act, the 1906 First and Drug Act. And that is a paradigm-shifting moment in the history of the United States. It is the first moment in the history of the United States that the U.S. government says there's a line in the U.S. Constitution to promote the general welfare. And that's the first time in the history of the United States that the U.S. government plants its feet and said the general welfare is making sure that people can trust what they eat and drink, and we're doing it, right? And every consumer protection agency that follows, the FDA, the USDA, OSHA, that is our worker safety, everything follows on that decision. But in the aftermath of this, industry is so angry with Harvey Wiley, who relentlessly pushed this until they were forced to have regulation, that they plant spies at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He's forced out. He goes to work for a woman's magazine, Good Housekeeping. He starts the laboratory there that checks foods to see if they're honest and creates something called the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. And he crusades and crusades for better food laws. The first food law was really corrupt. And so in 1938, we got a better law, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I want to briefly, I know I'm about out of time, but I want to briefly then move this forward to now. So with this book and with Poisoner's Handbook, my previous book, those books are taught a lot in American high school chemistry classes as a way to say to chemistry students, guess what? Chemistry is actually kind of cool, and, you know, here's these great murder stories, and here's ways that you can think about your food. So a high school chemistry teacher in Colorado sent me this experiment he did with modern food. Some of you may know the Green Giant label. If you look at these peas, you'll see two very different colors of peas on the plates. The grayish-green peas are, in fact, the peas that come normally out of the can. This is what they look like today. But my chemist took one of the old coloring agents that they used to use in the early 20th century, copper sulfate. And he treated these Green Giant peas over here with copper sulfate, and he got these beautiful green peas. So, and he said to me, no wonder people liked copper sulfate in their peas. They looked so much better. But then he did a second experiment over here in which he pureed the peas with the copper sulfate and then put a nail into the mixture. And if you look at the end toward the nail head, you'll see it's coated with copper, that the copper redeposits out of the peas and into the nail, or if you were eating peas that had been greened this way, you'd be eating copper too, right? So it's a really good case study in why we want these things out of food, big time. So the last thing I want to say briefly is we haven't gotten to where Harvey Wiley would have wanted us to get. He felt very much that there were too many compromises in the regulation, that it accommodated business way too much. He was very angry about that. He eventually wrote a book right before he died called A History of a Crime Against the Food Law, which is really a bad book, but has a lot of instances of government sort of eroding the protections. And that continues, and he wasn't wrong. In the United States today, the erosion of the Food and Drug Law still causes enormous problems for us. And just to give you an example of that, the United States, the USDA is responsible for inspecting 80,000 food processing facilities. About 11,000 of those are considered critical in that they handle produce or something that, you know, is easily contaminated. The rotation schedule for inspection with the understaffing of the FDA, because this law is so unfunded, is every 5 years. So these factories are inspected in the United States every 5 years, right? The USDA, under the Meat Inspection Act, has a much more vigorous inspection program, and they actually station inspectors in the plants. But that's about to change under the Trump administration. And the new rules of the Trump administration are to pull out all the government inspectors and let the industry police itself, which, if my talk about 19th century food should have told you anything, it's that that's a really bad idea. But we are in a moment in the United States, at least, where we're seeing some of these very basic, I don't think they're strong enough. You can get me on my soapbox about what I want to see on a label another time. But we are at a moment in the United States where we're seeing some of these very basic consumer protections be pulled back in favor of industry. So I think my lesson is not so much we have won this war, but we are still fighting it, and that it really matters, and that we should not give up, because in fact, it is the job of the government to stand for each of us in our individual lives and stand between us and people who would try to make our food and drink supply unsafe. Thank you.
Grazie mille, grazie Deborah, complimenti.
Thank you.
Abbiamo forse un minuto, ma proprio un minuto per fare delle domande prima della prossima conferenza, per cui se avete una domanda alzate la mano, fatevi vedere, sbracciatevi. Laggiù c'è un signore che si sbraccia. Ah sì, la cuffia.
Oh. Lots of headphones.
Aspetti un secondo, che si mette la cuffia. Ok, prego.
Yes.
Se sa dirci qualcosa sulla situazione in Europa, se è successo qualcosa di simile in Europa o se è diverso, insomma. Grazie.
Well, in Europe in general, the regulatory principle has been different and therefore stronger. So in general, Europe follows what we call a precautionary principle, which if the material looks like it might pose a risk, we're going to pull it out until it's proved safe. That doesn't work perfectly, but you see that a lot more in European regulations. And so if you look at some of the things that are permitted in the food supply in the US, they are not permitted in Europe. And if you look at some of the things that are permitted in cosmetics in the United States, they are definitely not permitted in Europe, right? I tend, when I'm having some of these conversations in the United States, to say, you know, if you want to buy cosmetics, don't buy cosmetics made in the United States, because we really do see these kinds of problems, or don't buy them in China. So the one thing that we have to really watch is not only our own regulations, but the acceptance of Is this like skipping out in some way?
Oh, sorry.
I'm just gonna.
Okay.
Okay. So the one thing I think that complicates this is the global economy. So that there are stronger regulations in Europe, but we work in a global economy where we take in a lot of products from other countries, and we don't necessarily have the apparatus in place to test them. So you might have, and I can't speak country to country in Europe, but I'm going to address that on two fronts. You might have a stronger apparatus in Europe. You might not have what you want, and we certainly see this in the US, which is enough resources dedicated to actual building of evidence and scientific testing of those materials, right? So you may say, well, this is suspect, but we don't have the money to actually check it out. Or this looks safe, but we are not going to invest in the kind of laboratories and testing. And that is a chronic problem in every country. The other problem is in the global economy, we import materials from other countries that sometimes go through far less of a safety procedure, and we don't always have, again, the defenses in place to run tests on those. And I'm going to switch from food for a minute to just give you an example, which was for a couple of years, I wrote a column for the New York Times called Poison Pen, which was about toxicology. And the very first one I did was on lipstick. And it was on heavy metals in lipstick, lead in lipstick. And in fact, lipsticks that have dark colors like reds and deep pinks can be very high in red lead and other heavy metal materials. The FDA actually, it takes you a while to find it, has an actual catalog of the levels of lead in these red and pink lipsticks, right? In general, the source of those high lead lipsticks is China, and there was a study done in Saudi Arabia. Off the chart when you looked at what your daily exposure to lead, which is pretty much next to nothing, should be, and what you were getting from lipsticks that you swallowed, right? So it's very hard when you see these cheap lipsticks. I'm a big believer, I'm rambling slightly here, in geographic labeling. But when you're seeing these inexpensive cosmetic products, you do want to know where they're manufactured. Because even though you may be in a country that has high safety standards for its own products, you actually don't know what the products are when they're coming from China, say. And certainly the Saudi Arabian study looking at bright red lipsticks found that all of the heavy lead lipsticks in Saudi Arabia had come from China. So it's tricky in the global economy to say, where are we protecting ourselves and where are we not? But Europe in general does better than the US, hands down.
Benissimo. Allora io ringrazio ancora Deborah Blum.
Thank you. Thanks.
Grazie a tutti voi. Rimanete qui perché do la parola al mio collega Alberto Agliotti che tra un po' sale sul palco. Sali subito? Vuoi intrattenere il pubblico? No. Allora ci vediamo tra 2 minuti 2.